mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brasher.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. The DU Podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, the official performance dog food of Ducks Unlimited. Purina Pro Plan, always advancing.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings. Joining me in studio today is my co-host, Dr. Mike Brasher. Mike, how are you?
I'm doing great, Chris. I'm full from Thanksgiving.
Good.
Ate too much.
Duck season opened. Everyone's excited.
It did.
That's awesome. Also joining us on today's podcast is Dr. Scott Stevens from Ducks Unlimited Canada. Scott, welcome back.
There we go.
Thanks. Always good to join you guys.
And the theme music continues.
The wrong was righted. He didn't have his theme music last time he was on the episode, on the podcast.
I know, because it was just Scott and I said, hey, Scott, I'm not going to play your theme music. And he's like, thank you.
No, did he say thank you?
I said that's okay.
He said that's okay.
That's what
okay.
I figured your response would have been. Of course he's going to say that.
That's right.
I think we had a discussion about if an ounce of pretension is worth a pound of manure was actually.
We had that conversation.
I don't remember that. Yeah, but you must not have been recording when you had that.
Well, we've got Dr. Stevens on the show today.
I'm moving along.
Moving on. We've got Scott Stevens on the show today because we, Mike and I and Scott, are going to be doing a species profile. We haven't done one of these in quite some time, really. I think it's been last season, Mike, last year even.
Yeah, and I guess Chris decided that I don't know enough about ducks, so we had to bring in the relief, which I agree with.
But I think it's important to have the heavy hitters on this particular episode, especially with this species profile, because it is the northern pintail. Yeah. Super popular species. Mike, if you want to go ahead and get started with this, where we just kind of, I think we originally started out these with, taxonomy, really, what is this bird? Just the introduction to the northern pintail.
Yep, for sure. And again, just to kind of reiterate, we have done a number of these in the past, and we worked through some of these. The pintail is one that's been on our list for obvious reasons. It is one of the most highly prized birds out there. It's one of the most beautiful birds out there. They're not as common, they're not as ubiquitous as mallards or some of the teal are, and so it's just a really cool bird. They also have been the focus of a lot of scientific and research over the past 40 years or more, and part of that relates to their population status and long-term decline in that population. And so it's a species around which we can tell a pretty interesting, although in some cases it's sort of a depressing story about what has kind of led to those declines. But then we can also talk about a lot of the conservation programs that Ducks Unlimited and others have put into place or tried to put into place to help reverse some of those long-term population declines. So a lot of information on this. And I guess, full confession, I was the one that said, let's bring Scott Stevens on, because I know he has spent way more time thinking about this bird and actually studying it up there on the prairies than I have, and he's going to be able to speak firsthand to a lot of this information. So with that kind of backdrop, we'll get right into this, as you said, Chris, and we're going to breeze through some of this because we want to get to the heavy conversation about what's going on with the population, what can be done, what are we trying to do. That type of information will be pretty unique among some of the others that we've talked about. So from a taxonomy standpoint, like which bird is this? What does it most related to? The scientific name is Anas acuta. It's in the same genus as most other dabbling ducks. There have been some taxonomy changes here the past few years, but it's in the same genus as most other dabbling ducks. Has taxonomic relatives including, I think, Eaton's pintail, yellow-billed pintail. I forget what one of the other worldwide species. White-cheeked. Yeah. What was the first one I said?
Eaton's?
The second one
you said Eaton's or something.
Yeah, Eaton's. And what's the other one I said? Yellow-billed. Okay, yeah. All right, so I was thinking white-cheeked, and I said yellow-billed, so I got him. And so the white-cheeked is actually in sort of the Western Hemisphere in Puerto Rico and some of the Caribbean areas. So I've actually seen white-cheeked pintails. Have you, Steve?
I've harvested a few this past summer in Argentina.
Oh,
yeah. Cool bird. Yeah, but you would recognize them as pintails.
Yeah. I didn't realize, it shows what I know about sort of their worldwide distribution of some of these species. I didn't realize that the white-cheeked pintail made it all the way into Argentina.
Yeah.
All right.
Learn something every day.
Yeah, there we go.
Shot yellow-billed there too.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Even more cool.
Yeah.
All right. So in terms of, let's see, any other relatedness over the species, we'll move right along here. The appearance, one of the most recognizable species, certainly when you're talking about the drake. They tend to have a longer neck than most other dabbling duck species. They have, especially when they're in full plumage, the drake is unmistakable. That chocolate-colored head with the white stripe going up the neck, very long. The pin feather, the pintail, and let's see, what else? The herringbone color on the side. So just, I would imagine most folks here know what a pintail
Yeah, and I
like.
think they're one of the easiest to identify for hunters too, because even silhouetted, you can see that pintail, the long neck kind of makes it a little more visible.
Yeah.
I think hunters can pick those out a little better than other species. Yeah. However, the female tends to be mistaken for a gadwall on occasion. Has happened before. So
they're kind of if you're trying to shoot drakes, they're kind of tough to sort out early in the season if you're in the north.
I was gonna say, I saw you kind of shaking your head a little bit there. Yeah, in the north, it's not as easy.
Right.
I'm basing it on where I'm hunting.
Yeah.
Here.
Yep. Let's see, about the size of some of the other dabbling ducks that we have. Probably, I didn't actually check on the weight here, but it's going to be in the neighborhood of a gadwall, I would guess, a little bit smaller than a mallard. And Scott, feel free to chime in here if I get any of this stuff.
I would just say, when I think about pintails, or how I would try and describe them to somebody who hasn't seen them, is they're, kind of long and slender, and the wings are also kind of streamlined, you would say. Actually, when they're flying and courting in the springtime, they remind me of shorebirds, the kind of wing shape, and they do all this darting and dancing. So, yeah, kind of unique in their flight, and a bunch of features of them.
Yeah, they are very well known for their aerial pursuits, where you'll have 6 or 8 or 12 drakes chasing and courting a single or two or three females. Very, very characteristic. So tons of photos out there of that acrobatic display. Yeah. And all ducks will do that, but pintails just, I think, because of the combination of what Scott talked about, just their appearance, their shape, and some of the movement, they really stand out as some of those more charismatic species during those courtship flights. Let's see. I guess we'll do the call for folks that want to know what this bird sounds like. Most folks that have been hunting for a while will recognize the distinctive sort of whistle, as we call it, of the drake. It's actually listed here in this app as the male buzz peep. So here it goes.
That's a new term for me.
We'll continue.
That's a new term.
We'll continue to call it the whistle, though. Yeah, there you
That's
go.
it.
And I would imagine most of us have a whistle on our lanyard to try to imitate the call of a pintail. Have you ever found those pretty effective?
No,
Scott. No.
No. Save your money. No. Like I have one on my lanyard. When pintails are out, I'm blowing that, but it's far more effective to blow the mallard hen call.
Speaking of the mallard hen call, we have also in this app here the female flight quacks. And Chris, you and I were commenting that it was very rare that we've ever
I don't think I've ever heard
that we've heard
that,
a female pintail quacking. Scott,
yeah,
any experience?
No, I haven't heard a ton of them either. Like I don't think they're nearly.
Sure, they do.
I don't think they're nearly as vocal as mallards.
So let's see. In terms of distribution, they are pretty cool in that regard as well. They're found throughout the northern hemisphere, globally. Sizable populations. I don't know what the numbers are, but sizable populations in Europe, breeding over there in Siberia and wintering in various locations such as Western Europe or portions of Africa and India and Asia. And we hear a lot of folks talking about some pintail research that occurs in Japan as well. well, and there's some fairly well documented exchange of band recoveries from in the U.S. that of birds banded in Japan and then vice versa. So we know that type of distribution occurs, and not all species that we have here in North America have that sort of circumpolar, that global northern hemisphere distribution. But
in North America, I would argue they're mostly a Western bird.
It depends on how you define Western.
Yeah, well, I would argue most of the
Mississippi flyway Western.
Yeah,
most of the population.
Yeah, I was going to say most of the breeding population would be in the prairies, and a significant number up into Alaska.
Yes,
there are pintails that breed in eastern Canada, but not nearly as many. So yes, they end up in Atlantic flyway, not nearly the numbers that we see in Pacific and Central and Mississippi.
Yeah. I really don't have a good handle on the breeding population estimates from, let's say, Hudson Bay, from the Hudson Bay lowlands, any other breeding regions of eastern Canada.
Yeah, well, the other factor that's at play, right, is just the breeding survey is not set up to count pintails wherever pintails occur. It's designed to count mallards, and we count pintails where they occur, but some of those areas are not well served.
Yeah. Also, to your point there, Scott, with this being sort of a quote more Western bird, their wintering distribution also kind of mirrors that. Probably, I don't know what the actual number is, but I'm going to guess close to half of the population is going to winter in the Pacific flyway.
Yeah, that sounds
pretty
about right.
Pretty close to another half will be in, just short of the other half will be in the Central and Mississippi combined. And then there will be 5-10% in the Atlantic flyway. That's probably going to be pretty generous. If we're looking at the distribution of harvest as an index of that distribution of the population size, that's kind of where it would fall out.
Yeah, I wondered how many halves you were going to have there to start with. But
it's a lot of halves.
I kind of had to back off
the third
of that.
half would be, no.
That's why I had to say close to a half, close to another half.
I think one of the most impressive things for me, and something that I learned when I started working for Ducks Unlimited, because I never really put it together, and some of our listeners might find it interesting, is that these birds, not the majority by any means, but there's a lot of pintails that breed in the Arctic. Mm-hmm. And Scott, you kind of hit it on that, where up in Alaska, Western Alaska, Northern Western Alaska, some of those areas up around the Arctic, really where you find a lot of snow goose colonies, breeding colonies. There are pintails up there as well.
Well, yeah, you'll have to indulge me, but can I tell a story about that? Like, I have a theory, Chris, as to why this occurs. Like, based on my experience with pintails on breeding areas in the prairies, they're really well adapted to be a species to take advantage of low nesting cover. And, I would cite things like they've got that super long neck, and if the hen is setting on a nest, she can see forever. So tundra areas kind of meet the same standard as really short grass prairie. And, for me, what was always cool is if you had a pintail nest you were going to monitor, you almost never flushed the hen off of the nest, because she would see you coming, she would sneak off in the grass, and she would flush somewhere, away from the nest. So, when I think about the kinds of habitats that pintails nest in the prairies, it's like, on the top of a hill, really short grass, could be a long ways from water. And then I think about tundra areas, it's like, those would be the same kind of places where I think, at least my theory would be their defense for predation is, hey, I'm going to be in a good vantage point and I'm going to see anything coming, and it might get my nest, but it's not going to get me.
That's a pretty interesting theory. That's awesome.
So it had some nesting within 15 yards of, maybe it was actually less than that, 10 yards of the tent that I was staying in on the YK Delta. I was really impressed at the number of pintails nesting up there. Of course, it's well known that is another very, very important breeding region for that species, and a lot of others as well.
Yeah. But did it have that kind of short grass?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Super short graze. There was it was hiding in amongst a little tuft of grass.
Yeah.
But very, very short grass conditions there.
And could they see you coming? Would they sneak off if you went to?
Nah, I think she had become habituated to kind of our presence there, because she's never snuck off. I actually was able to get within about 5 yards of her and take some pretty cool photos. Cool. So, but that was, after multiple days of just kind of figuring out that, okay, these people are here all the time.
Yeah.
They haven't tried to eat me yet.
You didn't tell her
Probably
who you were.
Okay.
It's fine.
No. I probably did.
You probably tried
I probably
that
did.
anyway,
So,
yeah.
so,
It's
Talk
fine.
softly to her. It's going to be okay. I'm just going to take a photo. Don't get off.
so the other thing that I think is cool to think about them and thinking about, once again, I'll show my bias, breeding areas, is you think about traditional areas that maybe used to have lots of pintails and maybe habitat alteration has changed that. They're also well adapted to get in and take advantage of very shallow water that may only be there for a short amount of time. And Mike, I know, will probably talk about, they have a lower clutch size, shorter incubation period. They are, on the breeding areas, they are set up to get in, get it done, get ducklings fledged. Ducklings fledge sooner than mallards do in less days. So they are really set up to deal with those ephemeral water areas that the water may not be around for long.
Yeah. And that affinity for large, for landscapes that have short vegetation where they can see a long way, that also extends to their breeding, or to some of the habitats that they use during winter. When you think about their prominent use of rice fields and other flooded agricultural fields, real short vegetation, you have to think that's also sort of an adaptation why they're so inclined to use those related to those same things. They'd like to be able to see, like to be able to see a long way. Mm. So yeah, in that regard, what about the boreal forest, Scott? How much do we see them nesting there? They're going to be primarily the prairies and Alaska. There's going to be some breeding populations or a small number of breeding birds in California and the Intermountain West, interior British Columbia. But how much do we think they occupy and breed in the boreal forest?
I would say some, not a ton. We definitely see more numbers in the boreal forest when we have the prairies go dry, right? There's that latitudinal movement. From a harvest management standpoint, they talk about the median latitude of the breeding population. And so, they will occur in there. It's, I would argue it's not the primary breeding location. We've talked about those, like, the prairies when they're wet are a prime breeding location. And there are some key areas in Alaska that birds go to. And, those populations have been more stable than the historic populations in the prairies.
And then also from a wintering standpoint, just kind of going back, when you think about their distribution and what I said about them being so closely tied to rice and other flooded agricultural landscapes, it should thus be no surprise that the three most important regions for pintail during winter, California Central Valley, the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana, and the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. And all those areas correspond to the major rice-producing regions in the U.S. And it's not to say they don't eat other grains, but the one thing that's really key about rice agriculture and being so beneficial for waterfowl is that it includes the infrastructure necessary to hold water on those fields during the winter, and that creates ideal habitat for pintails and other ducks, assuming we've got food in there. So that's what we see in terms of a winter distribution. That's not to say that you don't find them in other places. You'll see them using a diversity of habitats. But if you want to see large concentrations of pintails, you go look for some of those large flooded agricultural fields in those areas.
That and this is just kind of a wintering distribution question for you two. What's the attraction to the coast? You've got not necessarily the rice fields that are along, Texas coast and even Louisiana a little bit, but, you see a lot of pintails. If you're hunting down, the Texas coast or even Louisiana. I mean, I was fishing in Louisiana last week and saw a ton of pintails down there. What's that attraction there? Is that, habitat availability maybe? Or is that a historical significance? Kind of like snow geese used to always go to the coast, but pintails have just not really changed. They still go to the coast, something like that.
I think it's a combination of both. It's that sort of that historical, that tradition, but it's also, it's a relatively reliable landscape in terms of waterfowl habitat. This year's an exception because it's like super dry all across the Gulf Coast. But yes, it's very consistent. Pintails are one of the more kind of philopatric. They show higher fidelity to areas than do some other species, and that includes some of their wintering geographies. So maybe it has to do with that. And I mean, the condition of those coastal marshes, when they're in good shape, They're going to be shallow, and they're going to provide the resources that the birds need. That's kind of my off-the-cuff explanation. Scott?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think diverse coastal marshes provide, a diversity of foods. I was thinking back, I shot 3 pintails this year in a spot where I was hunting canvasbacks because it had really good sago pondweed in there. So they are taking advantage of submerged aquatics where it's abundant too. And that would definitely be the case along the Gulf Coast also. Mike, you talked about a bit of phylopatry too. I recall from, my days in the Mississippi Delta, just the cool things that you would see of how in tune with the change in conditions they were. And, you would get a big rain in the Mississippi Delta and there would be pintails show up from the Gulf Coast, flying low over, shallowly flooded, ag fields and moist soil and all those kind of things. But overnight, if you got a 3-inch rain, there would be pintails and green-winged teal would show up in the Mississippi Valley that were not there the night before. So
the other thing that I'll say is going back to the Gulf Coast, Texas specifically, pintails are known to, some subset of the pintails wintering on the Texas coast are known to use the shoalgrass beds in the Laguna Madre. They'll forage on the rhizomes of shoalgrass. In some cases, 80-90% of their esophageal contents would be shoalgrass rhizomes based on some of the studies that have been conducted down there. Whether those pintails belong to some other cohort of pintails, I don't know. I'm not really sure why some would choose to do that, and I don't know what we've learned from more recent research about how, are pintails that you find using shoalgrass beds in that hypersaline lagoon system always going to be using that, or do you see them go into the flooded ag landscape? I'm sure you do. Matter of fact, as I hear myself saying that, we've seen that before. We've seen that out there on the Texas coast where we'd be out on Matagorda Island. A lot of birds using the laguna and then using the freshwater ponds on the island. Then all of a sudden we get a big rain and there's no more pintails around on the island. They've all gone inland. The other thing, this is a good opportunity for me to say that there are a lot of other people studying pintails right now using some of the latest GPS tracking devices. And we spoke with one of the, I'm trying to think if Javon Bank is actually doing any pintail work right now. I think he's done some pintail work. And so there are other folks there. Bart Ballard has a student doing some pintail work. And so we'll bring them on at some later date to talk about some of the specifics of their research related to movements and addressing some of these questions.
Yeah, I think one of the fascinating questions that we get here, I get quite a bit, and I can pretty much say I don't know to just about any question that I get, but I have the luxury of doing that. So
and most of the times you're right.
Yeah, that's right. I'm always right. Scott, it's been a while since you lived in Memphis. Yeah. But there's a field, and if anybody's listening to this who drives Highway 40 or Interstate 40 coming out of Memphis, crossing the bridge, going into Arkansas, just when you get past West Memphis, there's a field there. And at least the guys that I talk to all the time, just call it Pintail Field. And it will, like, late December, early January, we'll get a 70-degree day and a huge rainstorm. And you're driving down 40 and, like, my phone's blowing up and they're like, the pintails are there. And this field loads up. I mean, it could be, some days it's 5,000, some days it looks like 20,000. I mean, this is just buzzing with pintails. And everybody around here knows what that field is. Like, there are people probably listening like, oh yeah, I know exactly where that is. But the question that I always get, or even the guys that I hunt with, they're like, the ducks just got here. The pintails just got. I'm like, no, man. Like, those just came from South Louisiana and Texas. Right. Like, they're coming north. They're shifting north with this new available habitat. And the cool part about it is a lot of these birds, you look out across the field, and if you're not going 95 miles an hour down 40 to keep up with traffic, and you slow down a little bit, you can look out there, and those things are covered with that rust color on their chest. And that's a good indication of them, feeding in a marsh, something like that. It's like, but that's the question that I get all the time. And is that something that's a lot of people think that's unique to pintails, or is it unique to pintails, or is that something that you see with a lot of other species where they'll travel? I mean, it's 400 miles from probably 350 from the coast to this field on Highway 40 or Interstate 40. They'll make that jump, and then, like you said, you walk out there the next day and there's not a duck in that field. They're gone. So that's an interesting distribution.
Yeah, it's getting to the point you ask, do other species do that the same way pintails do? It's getting to the point where, I mean, like for white fronts and for snow geese, there's data coming out showing those birds are making long movements. But there's also data on mallards in West Tennessee, which show those things are pretty sedentary. Now, a lot of this, I would wager that a lot of this is going to be landscape and context specific. And context can also include the species that we're talking about, but not all landscapes are the same. They're not all the same in terms of the type of resources they provide, the type of disturbance that birds are receiving, the amount of habitat that's available, and so forth. But it's getting to the point where previously I would think that, all ducks do that, make these large movements during the winter, east, west, north, south, as habitat conditions or disturbance regimes change. But we're seeing some data that suggests that's not necessarily uniformly the case, and that makes it pretty interesting right now. Some do, but there are probably others there are others that aren't doing so much.
Yeah, I think you're bang on when you say it's context specific. So what you were describing, Chris, there, especially if that's happening in January, it's like, I'll bet money that's birds moving up from the coast and they are ready to head north, right?
Oh, there's courtship flies. You can sit there and watch courtship flies.
Those birds are thinking about, hey, when are the prairies going to open up at that time of the year? So they're pushing north up against ice lines and that sort of thing. But, they're also driven by the need to get the energy that they need to make those jumps and fuel that migration and, put on the reserves that they need to do that. They'll get most of the protein that they need once they arrive on breeding areas, but fueling that carbohydrates and fat to fuel migration happens in those areas. So context specific, but it is something that we've discovered about pintails in almost all the studies that we've done like that, Mike, right? Like, I mean, I think back to Bobby Cox's work along the coast and it was like, he could tell when it rained in the MAV because overnight his birds would show up there. So
and that was before GPS tracking devices were available, and that crazy guy, got in planes and would fly all over the Mississippi alluvial valley. And
how was he marking the birds?
Just with the VHF transmitters, the ones that you had to detect by way of a handheld antenna or a strut mounted, in the case of airplane, strut mounted antenna.
Yeah.
But again, so pintails may be a little bit easier to find them whenever they make those long distance movements because of what I talked about earlier. We have such a good understanding of their affinity for those specific landscapes, right? And so it's not like he had to go to he wouldn't be spending his time traveling to Alabama or East Texas looking for pintails. He was highly suspicious that if I can't find these birds in southwestern Louisiana, they're either going to be in the Texas coast or they're going to be in the Mississippi, the Mississippi alluvial valley, northern Louisiana, western Mississippi, or Arkansas. So it made it a little bit easier, I think, just to try to locate them in that case.
Yeah, I think every time we get data like that, we're always a bit amazed about the movements. But, I do stop and think it's like, we're fortunate that they have wings and they're as mobile as they are because, if things go dry, we kind of freak out like, oh my gosh, the Gulf Coast is super dry. It's like, guess what? They will find an area where it's not dry.
Especially in a year like this, so dry.
They will not hang around, and I would venture to guess starve to death, Brasher. That ain't going to happen.
They're not
going to happen.
Just hope they can find some water before they do run out of fuel and all their travels. So let's move on here. We've covered a lot of information here already, but I think one of the things that y'all mentioned kind of leads nicely to this next sort of timing of things, pair formation. They're a species that does develop pair bonds a little bit earlier than some species. They're probably in that same range as mallards. They'll start forming pair bonds in late fall, early winter. I looked up some statistics here from some past studies in the Central Valley of California, and these are going to differ a little bit from year to year and from region to region, but this will give you an idea. In the Central Valley, there's one study that documented about 50% of the females that they were observing were paired by November, let's say mid-November. But then once it got into December and January, that's when the courtship and the pair bonding really started, such that by January, 90% of the females had established pair bonds. And that same trend is generally gonna apply in other areas. But by December, January, the vast majority of those pintails are gonna have formed pair bonds because they're one of the earliest birds to migrate north and begin nesting along with mallards in the mid-continent and black ducks, I guess, as well. They'll start heading north a little bit early too. So, yeah. Anything to add, Scott?
No, I just have vivid memories in January of pintails doing those courtship flights in the Mississippi Delta, Mike, when I was in grad school. I wasn't very successful in getting in the right spot to harvest many of them, but you could see them out there, and it was cool to watch.
Your decoys on the water were not what was on their mind.
No.
What was on their mind was that one female that those 15 drakes were chasing, and they were all intensely competing for that one female because they knew their opportunity and their time was running out. And that is one of the reasons why, and we hear this a lot, people talk about, and we'll get to the sex ratio here in a minute. It is male bias. There is a stronger tendency. I guess I'll get to it right now. There is a tendency.
Skip right to it.
The pintails have a male bias sex ratio, like most, if not all, duck populations. And I always hate saying all because, it's like there's always going to be an exception. But let's just say most duck populations. Male bias sex ratio a bit higher of a male percentage than females, and there's a whole conversation and line of research happening right now in the waterfowl science community about some shifts in those sex ratios, with them becoming increasingly male dominated. And people oftentimes will talk about how they're seeing 20 and 15 drakes to one pintail late in the season. Part of that is going to be simple mathematics. If by December and January, 80 to 90% of the females are paired, you're not really going to be seeing those females up and around quite as much as you would the others. And so it's going to be, I would imagine, a bit of an observation bias. You're more likely to see those large groups of birds. Now, we'll probably have people call in or write in and say you're crazy. But
we'll give them your email, Mike.
We'll give them your email.
But I would imagine that is some of it, is because what I was saying in January, most of the females are paired, and so you're going to have a lot of those unpaired males chasing a small number of females that are still out there.
And not to backtrack back to kind of the courtship behavior, but it is something that's very obvious that a lot of our listeners out there have seen. But if the birds are paired up in November, December, getting into January, I've been up to the Rainwater Basin in March, where you can sit there and look at these 10-acre wetlands, these waterfowl production areas that are just loaded with like 5,000 to 10,000 pintails. I mean, they're just packed into these things. And there is just a continuous cycle of courtship flights. So if these birds are, and that's the first week of March. So if these birds are majority paired up early, what are these ducks doing in March in the Rainwater Basin where you're seeing these courtship flights? Are there still additional courtship flights? Are they still competing for that hen by the time you get to March?
Well, so my contention is that for those courtship flights, and I don't know this, but I'm going to guess that's still an unpaired female. And she could be a young female. And I don't know enough about how a female signals when she's ready to be paired and why this would, or if these are males that are trying to sort of usurp that female from the bird that she had been paired with. I don't know enough about all that.
What do you know enough about?
I don't know. We'll get there. We'll get there eventually. But I also want to say that, with my earlier comment about sort of an observation bias on what people are seeing and talking about, I don't for a second mean to suggest that there hasn't been a shift in the sex ratio in any duck populations or with in pintails in specific. I mean, I think there is pretty good evidence from some of the data that I've seen that we are seeing an increasingly male-biased sex ratio in pintails and a few other duck species. There's going to be an entire special session at the upcoming Duck Symposium talking about sex ratios in ducks and kind of what's going on there. So it's a very research-rich topic right now.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the ones that are paired, I'm not sure how they signal that either. Like, makes me wonder. It's like, okay, does the one that's paired get up and like 14 drakes show up and like, hey, how you doing? Right?
Yeah, we see it often in mallards where the female will incite this kind of incite her mate to kind of At least that's the way my understanding of what she's trying to do. She's inciting her mate to kind of chase off all these intruders, but you see it on the water.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the pintails are doing in that regard.
Well, I would argue most of that pintail courtship happens in the air. So it's like, how are you,
That's what I was thinking there.
Sorry to backtrack you there, but I was just curious. I mean, once they get to the rainwater basin, they're just a hop away from, the U.S. prairies and even the Canadian prairies. That's a pretty easy jump for pintails. So they're close. That's a different game.
The timing of spring migration. What do you know about that, Scott?
Well, I would argue many of the pintails are always pushing the ice line, right? Because as we talked about, they're nesting in April. They're the first birds that show up,
mid-April.
When we've got one puddle of water that's open, that's shallow water that's opened up on the prairies, it's like pair of pintails will be the first birds that you see. So they're, as weather dictates, they're pushing that ice line. And, Chris, places like the rainwater basin, you're right, like they'll get hung up there if that area is open water and the U.S. prairies in South Dakota are still frozen. That's when they set in the basins, but they're always checking. You can be sure there's always some that are scouting saying, is it open yet? Oh, no, not yet. Back to the basins. But there are some years too when it opens up and, when the rainwater basin would be open, might be open all the way through North Dakota at the same time.
With that said, there is variation in the timing of this migration, with some birds not departing the Texas coast until April or late March, let's say. And so some of the research that I was talking about earlier with Bart Ballard and one of his students, and others are partnering on that research as well, is trying to answer that question. Like, what are the reproductive consequences of these different migratory strategies, whether it be the route that they take or the timing that these birds take it? There is variation, and so there's another interesting question that we'll be able to bring some data to, hopefully, eventually on the podcast with some of those folks.
No, I remember being in discussions about those kind of things too, Mike, because, one of the methods that we used to use was we'd harvest birds in those areas and look at their body condition, right? And my question was always, well, are the ones that are left behind in those areas later, are those the ones that, have not gotten to the body condition that they need to get to migrate further north? So, do you have sort of a sampling bias like you talked about earlier?
Yeah. And what about those birds crossing the border? How many, or what's the idea of how many of these birds are crossing into Mexico and going further south? I've heard people discussing that there's a pretty hefty population of wintering northern pintails in Mexico. Could those later migrants just be making their way north from further south? That's why they're there, or is that something that's documented as those birds have wintered there all season?
Yeah, I guess I forgot to account for that half of the pintails, so we need to add another half.
We're adding a half.
That's right.
The other half.
Back up to about 3 halves.
The sixth half.
3.5 halves.
Yeah. I think, Chris, that's context dependent too. Years like this where it's like, hey, if the Gulf Coast is dry, then I would expect there to be more pintails pushing further south into places like Mexico, and the numbers may be up in some of those wintering areas, but there are traditional wintering areas down there too that hold birds.
Yes,
but
Western Mexico, for sure.
But like many areas that pintail use, they can be wet and be awesome, and they can go dry and be like, yep, you don't look for pintails there because it's bone dry. Kind of the same thing on breeding areas. We have some of those that go dry and it's like, yep, don't look for pintails there this year, but when it gets wet, they will be there like crazy. So
I am glad you brought that up, Chris, because we would have been remiss if we did not mention the importance of Mexico to pintails. I think they're probably, when I think about the 4 most abundant duck species that breed in North America, but then winter in Mexico, I'm thinking about blue wings, I'm thinking about pintails, widgeon, and shovelers. I mean, and so pintails are going to be in the top 4 in terms of the number of ducks that are traveling there from the U.S. and Canada into Mexico. So definitely very important. West coast of Mexico is pretty important. the east coast of Mexico, there on the Gulf Coast, is also pretty important. But I think Sinaloa, the state of Sinaloa, and some of those historic estuaries there were super important. There was some rice production over there as well back in the day. I don't know how much of that is still occurring. I think a lot of it's being converted to shrimp farming. The other thing, let me back up a little bit and talk about distribution, because I said rice and reminded me that the Atlantic Flyway, not to totally forget about them and the distribution of pintails there. We did talk about how there is a breeding population. There's some breeding pintails in eastern Canada. Some do come from the prairies over there. But South Carolina, with their historical kind of rice culture, would have been a traditional sort of stronghold, I would imagine, for pintails on the Atlantic Flyway. I don't have a good handle on let's say, wintering numbers in the Atlantic Flyway right now. I have some harvest estimates a little bit later on, but they're just a fraction of what we see in the other flyways. So probably ought to do a break here. We're not going to be able to get through all this in the time frame that we've got.
All right, well, let's take a break. We'll come right back.
Stay tuned to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, after these messages.
Hey everybody, we're back, and I've got Dr. Mike Brasher and Dr. Scott Stevens. Doctor. And we are talking about the northern pintail. This is our profile, our species profile in the northern pintail, and we are back. Mike, do you want to go ahead and restart this conversation? We can talk about, we were kind of getting into winter distribution. We talked about that pretty thoroughly. I feel like we covered that quite a bit, and we wanted to move into maybe some feeding habits. One thing we hadn't talked about, I don't know if it's on your list, but we didn't really talk about clutch size. We didn't talk about breeding.
Breeding ecology, that comes
next. Yeah, okay, well, let's talk about food habits.
We'll try to be quick on this. They're a pretty generalist forager. They'll eat seeds. They'll eat invertebrates of all different types, kind of depending on where they are. We've already referenced how closely tied to rice fields they are. Obviously, they're going to be a big grain eater in those kind of situations. They love moist soil vegetation, or the seeds from moist soil plants. They'll eat seeds from various coastal marsh plants. They'll eat rhizomes from shoal grass in the Laguna Madre. In those situations, they're pretty diverse forager. I don't know them to eat a whole lot of acorns or things like that. I mean, it's why you don't see a lot of them in flooded forest and forested wetlands. You just don't see very many of them there, and so I don't know, Scott, if you have any experience with them. I'm sure somebody out there listening has said they've killed a pintail and it had acorns in its crop, and I wouldn't doubt that, but it's not something that you expect to see.
Yeah, I'd be surprised by that too. It would have to be small acorns because, like just looking at the size of their bill, and I think of them as feeding on, small seeds, those kind of things. I would point out, you guys have a southern bias when you think about what pintails feed on. I was thinking, yep, and they like peas, and they don't need to be wet up here when they're feeding on stuff. So barley and wheat, and they're walking around in waste grain fields up here. But it tends to be smaller seeds. Like I would think, when I think about peas, that these are dry peas grown in fields up here in Canada. That's a pretty good chunk to find in their crop. Like an acorn is 2 or 3 times that size. I don't see that happening much.
Yeah, and they do. That is a good point about them feeding, being a dry field feeder. Not all ducks will do that. Some are much better at it than others. Pintails are right up there with mallards. Yeah. And I guess it would be pintails and mallards probably the number one and two,
widgeon
right?
will do it too.
Widgeon. Yeah. So anyway, they will do that. And let's see. Of course, they go through the same type of dietary shift as we get closer to the breeding season, where proteins become more important, especially for the female. And so when you're looking for protein in your diet, if you're a duck, you're going to be eating all sorts of aquatic bugs,
fairy
and worms,
shrimp,
and things like that. Yep, fairy shrimp. They'll eat little crustaceans, little mollusks, and things.
Which is when you may see them in like a bottomland
snails.
Habitat. If they're in there later in the season trying to eat invertebrates, that if someone does say, "Oh yeah, they're in there."
Yeah. Need calcium for egg formation.
I recall shooting one in the woods, Chris. When it was a mallard hole, but it was like in January, right?
Oh yeah.
So
that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
You don't see that. I think you see it almost every year. You see a couple people will send a picture or something where I see like shot one pintail in a traditional green timber hole.
Yeah.
But it's pretty rare.
Yeah.
They get corrupted by those mallards. Can't resist.
That's right. See the big swirl going in, and they just go right along with it. So, they'll eat any type of grain, corn, obviously as well. So, not a whole lot too surprising with or unique, I guess, other than maybe the shoalgrass rhizomes. That probably is one of the more unique aspects of them. When you think about all the other type of foraging that we just did, dry field feeding on peas and corn or flooded rice and inverts, etc. But then they also are known to feed heavily on shoalgrass rhizomes in very salty water, which then requires them to go get that dietary fresh water. Widgeon do that as well. It's a little bit interesting there.
Yeah, I think they're also a bit unique. Like you think about that slender, long neck. So, I suspect, they like shallow water, but they're probably feeding a little deeper of the shallow water than like blue-winged teal are, right? Just because with that neck, they're reaching seeds and, tubers and those kind of things at a greater depth than a teal would with a short neck.
Scott, I'm gonna talk next about sort of the breeding ecology, and then I'm gonna just real quick, like age at first breeding, those types of things. But then I'm gonna come back and ask you to talk about breeding habitat preferences, things of that nature, because I think that's gonna sort of lead into some of the other questions about like their conservation issues, and then we'll close out. Maybe we'll move things around here. We'll close out with a conversation briefly about sort of survival rates, harvest rates, and things of that nature. So with that said, real quick sort of primer here on pintail breeding ecology. We have already talked about they'll first start arriving on the breeding grounds mid-April. This is going to be a little bit later if you're talking about birds arriving in Alaska, but if we're talking about arriving on the prairies, we're looking at mid-April. They will breed at 1 year of age, so birds that were born this year will be capable of breeding next year. They're pretty short-lived species, and so when you're a pretty short-lived species, you have to be geared to breed as quick as possible. Let's see, nest sites, and Scott, you can also elaborate on this, but we've talked about it a little bit also. They have a strong preference for that short or mid-grass prairie, very short vegetation. They have, one of the things that I found said they have a relatively large breeding home range compared to some of the other dabbling ducks that nest in that landscape. They are a ground nester. Let me say that before I forget to do so. But with regard to that home range, 1,200 acres was the average home range size from a study some 30, 40 years ago. I don't know. That's not a very research-rich sort of metric there, home range during the breeding season. There may be some other folks that have some data out there, but clutch size, 7 to 8 is what I found, which is a little bit smaller than what we see in other species. Nest success can be highly variable, like in most ground nesting duck species. Scott, you actually did some research on this for your PhD, but I found reports from various studies anywhere from 2 to 3% nest success for some study area and year, all the way up to like 43% during 1 year of study in Alaska. So there's a high variation in nest success. I was going to say predation is going to be the primary cause of those nest failures, and that's partly true, but there's also a very important, I guess, a percentage of pintail nests that are lost to agricultural activities associated with spring seeding. That gets to some of the other conservation issues around this species and some of the programs we're trying to put in place. Incubation period of 22 to 24 days. To your earlier point, Scott, very short incubation period compared to some of the other species that are ground nesting dabbling ducks. Time to fledge, about 45 to 60 days, so a month and a half to 2 months once those little ducklings hit the ground. And like most other duck species that we have here in North America, the moment within 24 hours of the eggs hatching, the ducklings are capable of going to the water, feeding themselves. They're precocial. That's That's what that's known as. It's a female parental care only. The male does not have any role in protecting or providing for the ducklings once they hatch. And of course, once the ducklings hit the water, they're after invertebrates. They're not eating seeds. They're eating all sorts of little bugs because they need all sorts of protein to build muscle and feathers and all sorts of tissue to help them grow super quick. What did I leave out, Scott? I'm sure you could add 30 minutes to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the cool things about nest sites is I know pintails are kind of notorious for you find lots of nests in little depressions, could be little burrows, in that short grass landscape. It's like if there's a little depression that gets them another couple inches down to kind of blend in with the landscape, you see that. So definitely common to find, a pintail nest in a little, in a little badger hole or burrow or something like that. So just one of their unique features.
And Scott, I just have a quick question, and I think this is a good question for you. Mike was talking about when the ducklings hatch, they're going straight to a wetland. What would be, if you could describe like the ideal wetland habitat, in the prairies, obviously, that these ducklings will find? Like what are they looking for when they're going to look for these wetland habitats to really get started that first 48 hours?
Yeah, so they're probably getting into very shallow wetlands that will be some of the richest invertebrate communities. When we think about brood survival, we think about seasonal wetlands being really important. So by the time the ducklings are hatching, some of those can be beginning to dry down depending on the year. But, the ideal conditions for duckling survival is when we have those seasonal wetlands get reflooded with a rainstorm and there's flooded vegetation and there's lots of places to hide. And, those are the years that when you do brood survey work, you don't see very many broods. That's because conditions are such that you see only a small percentage compared to other years where the wetlands are drawing down and there's nothing emergent that's flooded, and you probably see every brood that's out there. So that may relate to a conversation that we had about some brood surveys a bit ago, but we'll leave that one for now.
I thought you might go there.
He was wanting to go there.
Yeah.
I could see it. It's like a stop sign that you see coming,
run
approaching
right
a quarter mile away. And it's like, yeah, there you are.
But best conditions are when we have those seasonal wetlands that are flooded, emergent vegetation, and they're full of aquatic insects. And so, the landscapes where we have those are the ones where we've kept that whole community of wetlands, all the way from ephemeral and seasonal all the way up to permanent wetlands intact. And then the birds have the choice of using all of those when good environmental conditions exist.
I didn't mention anything about renesting propensity. I'm going to throw that one to you. I have a note here, but I want your take on that, Scott, because like I said, you studied some of these birds.
Yeah.
So tell us renesting propensity. Remind folks what it is and how does it compare in pintails to some of the other species?
Yeah. So renesting propensity is if you lose your first nest, how likely are you to nest again, make another attempt or multiple attempts? And I would argue that pintails are probably the poorest at this feature. Like if conditions are really good, we have good wetland conditions and lots of invertebrates and food is available, they will renest, but it is at a lower rate than mallards for sure. I mean, mallards, they are like the Energizer Bunny. They just keep going and going and going. If they're losing nests, pintails, like once, sure, twice, maybe, 3 times, probably not. And I think it goes back to you thinking about those classic landscapes that they're attracted to. It's like, well, if you keep drying too long and those areas are drying out, it doesn't do you any good if you hatch ducklings and then all the wetlands are dry. And so I think probably in the evolutionary time scale, that's probably what constrained that renesting propensity for pintails.
Scott, this is probably a good place for us to transition to what we've learned through the years about how the unique nesting ecology of pintails has positioned them to be a little bit more vulnerable than than, let's say, some other species in terms of kind of what's happened for land use on the prairies, the areas that are most important to them in that particular geography. And I guess what I need to do here for folks that may not be aware is just kind of lay out a little bit about the population status of this bird and how it has changed over the past, 55 or 65 years. And if you go all the way back, this is data that comes from the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey, the May survey. Breeding population survey had been conducted every year except for 2 since 1955. If you go all the way back to 1955, you look at these breeding population estimates for northern pintail, and they're like 10 million. Now, I don't know, that's a really odd number, 10 million, when you look at we're now down south of 2 million. But those first 5 or so years of the survey were really, really high. I don't know if we'll ever have like total confidence that there were really 10 million breeding pintails. That's still hard for me to fathom, that we would have had 10 million breeding pintails and they would have declined to an estimated 4 million breeding pintails within like 5 years. Maybe it did. I don't know. But anyway, if you go back and look at that survey, you will notice that real high blip at the very part of the survey. But I know a lot of people are, even when you focus on, let's say, early 1970s to now, you see a dramatic decline. From the 1970s period, we were averaging about 6 million pintails in the breeding population at that time. And I've been part of some conversations recently with some scientists there in the Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Bird Office that have looked in detail at some of these data. And when you go from the early 70s forward, there's a high degree of confidence in the quality of that data. Anytime you start a new survey, there's some things that are going on the first few years. You're having to figure things out. You're making a few tweaks. But when you get into it to this point, like the early mid-70s, we're pretty confident in that 6 million breeding population estimate for that bird.
I'm suspect of those early numbers from the 50s too. Like, that's a wild number of pintails. If that was real, I'd have loved to have seen that.
Isn't that true? It may have been. Yeah, could have been. I would. Yep. But even when you look at like 1970s on, we were dealing with average BPOP at that time in the 6 million range, and when the 1980s hit, the extreme drought of the 1980s, we saw dramatic declines in duck populations in the prairies for all species. Some species recovered, but pintails not quite so much. They did a little bit and got back up just north of 4 million, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, but now we're back down around 2 million. So from the 1970s to now, we've seen, what's that, about a 60% decline or something of that nature, if I do the math on the fly, something like that, about a 60% decline. So Scott, that's sort of the backdrop for why there has been so much attention to this bird, this species. It is one where we have seen long-term population declines, and we've seen those declines at a time when in those same landscapes where we know pintails will nest, we've seen other species increase or at least recover from depressed populations. So that led to a lot of investigation trying to figure out what was going on. So I'm going to turn it over to you and let you kind of narrate what we surmised, what we studied, what we found.
Yeah, so that's a big topic to tackle. But yeah, the numbers in the 70s, we definitely saw declines in pintails. Now, I think some of the things that we've talked about is, if you think about what we described, landscapes with shallow wetlands, short grass, those were easy landscapes to convert to agriculture because, the wetlands were shallow and there wasn't much needed to drain those. So, that propensity probably put them, in a situation where there was lots of habitat loss. And those areas also correspond with pretty rich soils too. So, those were some of the first areas converted to agriculture. So there's that challenge. But yeah, this early nesting propensity, there was a time, we know during that 70s period where agricultural practices were that, like in Prairie Canada, there was like half of the agricultural land that wasn't planted to a crop every year and was just fallowed. So they would let it grow up in weeds, and then they would go in later and cultivate that. But the pintails had probably already had a chance to nest in that habitat
Yeah, so Scott, I want you to unpack that a little bit, because I remember when we were writing an article on the Pintail a few years ago, I called Jim DeVries and was talking about this. And Jim DeVries is a friend and colleague of ours he's Dr. Pintail up there for DU Canada. He's now retired, but he was the one that really put in a lot of work to decipher sort of what all has been going on. And I talked to him about this, and it took me a while to fully wrap my head around the timing, because the timing of this is critical, because I had always heard about the part of, if you go back to the 70s and in through the maybe 80s, I forget really when the decline started, the very thing that you said is that about half of that agricultural land was fallow. But then I couldn't piece, something just was amiss in my mind. And so what I figured out, it was exactly what you said, in that when these birds arrived in the spring, that area that was fallow had started to grow up in some weeds, right?
And there was time for them to hatch a nest in there. So you think about these birds showing up in April or early May and laying 8 eggs, and would we say 22 days to incubate? That's like 30 days you need, right, to get everything done.
But then the producers come in let's say early summer, and they would disc that fallow area, right, to begin to prepare it, do some weed control, and begin to prepare it for growth or for farming the next spring, right?
Yeah, but that disking the fallow didn't happen until everything for that year was seeded, right? So it's that part that bought the time to get them through the 30 days, get them through basically May, even into mid-June, before the farmers started tilling that fallow.
And then the other half that they did put into spring production during a given year, they would harvest it, and then they would leave it untouched until the following, because it would then go into the what is fallow, and so it would be untouched until that early summer, midsummer, once they had gotten all of their other planting done, right?
Yeah. So when we talk about half of the cropland, at first maybe that doesn't seem like much, but that could be what would we have? 30-some million acres of cropland across the Canadian prairies. So that's like 15 million acres of fallow nesting habitat mixed in with wetlands. And then basically agricultural practices changed. Now, that fallow strategy probably wasn't great from a soil conservation standpoint. There were other challenges with that. But, we moved more to where half the acres were not fallow. More of them were planted every year, managed with, herbicides and those kind of things. And basically we lost that summer fallow, it was called. And then almost all of that cropland would be planted on an annual basis. And that's probably responsible for that decline since the 70s. And, the peaks haven't been as high. And, maybe not to bum people out, but I'm not sure we're ever going back to pintail populations like we had in the 70s there, unless we see a huge scale of change in agricultural practices again across the prairies. And maybe that could happen as we think about climate change and those challenges that brings. But that was a big driver.
Scott, I would mention something to Mike about, a program when I first started at DU. It became pretty popular with DU Canada. And it's an interesting habitat switch, but it's the winter wheat program.
Yeah.
And how that winter wheat, that short grass, native grass, is very similar to winter wheat. And I think we have some research that shows that it was fairly successful for pintails. Can you kind of elaborate on that? Just kind of talk about that and whether or not that those types of programs are still ongoing.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that is something that we instituted because, there was a lot of work done and it looked like there was potential, because pintails, one of the other unique things that I don't think we've said, Mike, is that from a nesting standpoint, when we do studies, they don't seem to have a strong preference for any kind of nesting habitat. So they will nest, we call it in science parlance, in proportion to availability. So if you've got lots of cropland stubble out there that's going to be planted to wheat, that's what they will nest in. So winter wheat is planted after the harvest in the late summer or early fall, and then goes dormant during the winter and then starts growing, but doesn't have that planting disturbance. And, there's some spraying of herbicides and that kind of thing, fungicides during the growing season, but there's not cultivation during the nesting period. So we did a bunch of research around that. We did a bunch of investment to help develop winter hardy varieties of winter wheat. And in fact, still today, most of the varieties of winter wheat that are planted across all of the prairies, U.S. and Canada, would be varieties that were developed through the labs that we invested in. So DU had a hand in helping develop those varieties that are still used today. Now, there have been economic challenges around, it yields pretty good. The quality is a little different than spring wheat. And from a market standpoint, it hasn't taken off like we hoped. Like we hope to have, half of the cropland be winter wheat. We're not at that stage because of some of those market challenges, but we still do promote winter wheat. Maybe the evolution of that is there's other things like fall rye that they've been working on, but we would love to have a way that tens of millions of acres of cropland were providing suitable nesting habitat, and that's really what winter wheat did. So we still have that program that we work with producers and help them understand how to grow winter wheat and how to be successful with it.
So it sounds like it wasn't necessarily specifically the winter wheat itself, it's the timing of how, you don't have basically a disc in there in April and May.
Yeah, so really we talk about fall seeded crops, and winter wheat was the primary one. Now there are discussions about, I talked about fall seeded rye and some of those things. So any crop that was planted in the fall and then lay dormant over winter and then just started growing where you didn't have to have that seeding activity and cultivation activity would fit the bill. But winter wheat was the one that at the time, and there's still some hope, has some economic viability and works out there on the landscape.
And if we didn't make it clear enough, so what happened when we lost that summer fallow is that we went to the continuous cropping, which meant that 30 million acres or whatever it is was subject to that spring planting practice, and a necessary part of that spring plant. Well, so the stubble would be left standing after the harvest the previous year. Pintails return north. They see what appears to them to be suitable nesting habitat in these stubble fields. Back in the time of summer fallow, that would have been okay. When you move to continuous cropping, if they nest in those areas, then along comes the mechanical equipment to do the seed prep and seed bed and planting, and that destroys some percentage of nest. The other thing that Scott, I think some research up there has documented, is that predation rates are higher in some of those spring seeded croplands. Is that right? So you sort of had a double whammy. You've got the mechanical disturbance and higher predation rates.
Yeah, higher predation rates in those than we probably anticipated at the front end, because it's like, what's going in there? But there must be other prey that predators are going in there to find, and they're stumbling across nests because nests are not at that high a density.
So that kind of led to some of the conservation, when we understood some of the conservation practices, when we used the science to understand what was going on, to document those nest losses. That's what kind of led to Scott's talking about. Are there other programs, Scott, that we're trying to implement there in Canada or in the U.S. prairies that you're aware of that are particularly valuable, or we hope will be particularly valuable for pintails?
Yeah, good question. I would say winter wheat or fall seeded crops are the primary thing that really is kind of pintail specific. Most of the other stuff that we do, protecting existing wetlands and protecting existing grass, that benefits, all the species of ducks and shorebirds and songbirds and everything that's taken advantage of those areas. So, fall seeded crops are kind of one of the uniquely pintail things. There are some landscapes that we talked about that remain, that get wet occasionally, that are especially attractive to pintails and don't have a ton of other birds in them. So there are some geographic areas that are pintail unique, but most of the other programs are kind of duck-friendly programs, not necessarily focused just on pintails.
And we talk about about breeding habitats in Alaska and maybe portions of the subarctic also being important for pintails, but there's not a whole lot of direct programs, not a lot of activity that we do there. We kind of hope those areas continue to be productive. Of course, they're facing their own set of changes and challenges, but yeah, one of the interesting things that I don't have the paper here in front of me, but the fact that we've seen these more challenging conditions in the prairies since the 1970s, where we've got where the nesting habitat is not as secure, it's not as productive. A lot of places, especially when you look into California, the birds the pintails that they harvest in that state are increasingly coming from Alaska. And that's really the case in any place, that any wintering destination that's going to get birds from both Alaska as well as the prairies. That Alaska population is increasingly important. The percentage of birds harvested in California that are derived from, let's say, the prairies has dropped dramatically since the 70s and 80s. So a direct reflection of the loss of productivity out of that prairie landscape that we're talking about. So, Scott, what type of priority science investments are you aware of that we're making there now? I've talked a little bit earlier about some of the ecology that's being studied with these GPS tracking devices, looking at how different migration strategies affect productivity and so forth. But what else might you be aware of?
I think some of the work on integrated population models for pintails is important to understand, at the big scale, whether what's driving populations, how much should we be focused on harvest and those kind of things versus reproductive success and things that we focus on from a habitat standpoint. So I know we've made some of those investments and that work continues. I think Mitch Wiegman and some of his students have been involved in that work. So those are some of the specific things. We had a big investment in the winter wheat research, and we were sampling all ducks, but there were a bunch of pintails in that. So those are the things that come to mind.
I know we continue to invest in research here and there on some of the wintering landscapes, again, seeing how pintails are using these different areas, and if there are differences in birds and the reproductive success of birds wintering in different geographies. That's some of the same type of information we get from these studies that you've mentioned there, Scott. We've covered a lot of material here. That on these species profiles, we typically go into things like harvest, recovery rates, survival rates. I mean, that's not a lot of detailed information that's significantly different from what we've talked about with some of the other species. Maybe we'll have an opportunity in the future to talk about that again with maybe some of the research, some of the science that we've talked about. I think those folks it'd be a good place to kind of supplement those episodes with that type of information. Otherwise, I think we've done a pretty good job here. It's a species that's like one of the more intensively studied duck species that we have out there. We've learned a lot. We feel like we've zeroed in on some of the key challenges, and unfortunately, those key challenges are massive in terms of what it's going to take to fully reverse it the way you talked about there, Scott. Yeah,
I would maybe just wrap by saying I think pintails are a cool, iconic species that everybody appreciates. Yeah, I'm not sure we're going to get back to populations of the 70s, but I think maintaining populations that we've seen in more recent decades is a pretty lofty goal, and that will require focusing on keeping habitat on the ground and things that many of us focus on every day out there. Cool species. They're fun to see on the wing. They're fun to listen to buzz peeps and those kind of things in the springtime. I could spend a long time talking about pintails.
Yeah. So keeping intact grasslands and wetlands on the landscape, hang on to what we've got, and try to find a way to get some agricultural practices that are more amenable to spring nesting pintails.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, this has been great. I know our species profiles are always popular. I'm pretty sure the pintail will be right up there at the very top, just knowing that how popular the species is in itself. But Scott, I appreciate you joining us today, bringing a wealth of information from DU Canada for the prairies and boreal. Mike, this has been fantastic. Glad you put it together.
Yeah, glad I could be here. Filled up some space.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll get you guys on to do another species profile in the near future.
Sounds good. Thanks.
I'd like to thank my co-host, Dr. Mike Brasher, for joining me today on the species profile of the northern pintail. I'd like to thank Dr. Scott Stevens for jumping on the DU podcast with us and sharing his wealth of knowledge about the species of the northern pintail. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for putting the show together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the DU podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to the DU Podcast, sponsored by Purina Pro Plan, the official performance dog food of Ducks Unlimited. Purina Pro Plan, always advancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit ducks.org/DU Podcast. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.